Petra would be left in the condition that you saw it in up there. For over 2,000 years, it's been in that state. God's judgment would be thorough and complete. The second thing that Edom prided itself in was her strong allies. Edom was the crossroads of trade in that time period. The king's highway ran through it. This wasn't some out-of-the-way mountain state. It might have looked like it from the video, but in all actuality, Edom, and especially Petra, was the New York City of its day. All trade would run through Edom, and they would charge lucrative duties for the trade that would flow through it. And other nations would forge alliances with Edom for the purpose of making sure that their products would make it to market. And these treaties helped to solidify the hold that Edom had on control of the markets in that time period. So not only did Edom feel secure because of her natural defenses, she felt safe and secure because of her extensive network of allies. She was impressed with what she had amassed. God wasn't. Let's look at verse 7. All your allies will force you to the border. Your friends will deceive you and overpower you. Those who eat your bread will set a trap for you, but you will not detect it. Check out this stroke of poetic justice. Edom, throughout its history, had constantly harassed Israel, constantly had attacked Israel. And now God would turn the tables on Edom by using her quote-unquote friends to destroy her. The end of the verse says, those who eat your bread will set a trap for you, but you will not detect it. Why didn't they detect it? These guys weren't stupid. They were sharp. They were known for their wisdom. They didn't see it coming because of what God had said in verse 3. He said, the pride of your heart has deceived you. Their pride had deceived them. The third thing that Edom prided herself in was her exceptional wisdom. And from a human perspective, this wasn't some empty, unfounded arrogance. The Edomites truly were known. They were renowned for their great wisdom. But again, God was not impressed. At the time of his judgment, these wise leaders had no game plan. They had no defense against God. Look at verse 8. In that day, declares the Lord, will I not destroy the wise men of Edom, men of understanding, in the mountains of Esau? The city of Teman in the south was named after one of Esau's grandsons. And the Temanites were known for their courage. They were like the gladiators of that country. They were known as mighty men of courage, mighty warriors. Look at verse 9. You warriors, O Teman, your warriors, O Teman, these mighty, courageous men, your warriors, O Teman, will be terrified, and everyone in Esau's mountains will be cut down in the slaughter. Edom was totally helpless. Even with all her natural defenses, even with her extensive network of alliances, of allies, even with her exceptional wisdom, when the day of God's wrath came, she had no answer. There was nothing she could do. I was pondering this, and I thought, every time in the Old Testament that God would predict his judgment on his own people, the people of Israel, he would always accompany that message of judgment with a promise. The promise was that he would always leave a remnant. But that promise wasn't extended to Edom. He totally decimated them. He totally destroyed them. Okay, that's the first section, God's judgment predicted. Let's look at verse 10. The second section of the book is God's judgment explained. I'm going to ask Brother Ken if he would read this passage.
Because of the violence against your brother Jacob, you will be covered with shame. You will be destroyed forever. On the day you stood aloof while strangers carried off his wealth and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem, and you were like one of them. You should not look down on your brother in the day of his misfortune, nor rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their destruction, nor boast so much in the day of their trouble. You should not march through the gates of my people, in the day of their disaster, nor look down on them in their calamity in the day of their disaster, nor seize their wealth in the day of their disaster. You should not wait at the crossroads to cut down their fugitives, nor hand over their survivors in the day of their trouble.
Thanks, Ken. It's bad enough when you see news accounts where you see just heinous, hideous, brutal crimes being committed. But it's even worse when you hear that sometimes these crimes are done against family members. It's a brother doing it to another brother. And that's what God found so offensive here. He was offended that Edom was complicit in the crimes that were done against Israel. That's what God was referring to here in verse 11. This time period, this account that Ken just read, it could have been referring to a time in 850 BC, when there was a coalition of the Arabs and the Philistines that ransacked Jerusalem, and they carried off all the palace treasures, and they took and carried away all the king's sons and the king's wives. Could have been then. It could have been 300 years later in 586 BC, when King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and imprisoned all her best young men. Remember Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Daniel? That's that time period. It doesn't really matter which time. It's not important that we know the exact time, because in both of those situations, the Edomites were involved. They were accessories to both of those atrocities. As the enemies were closing in on the capital city of Israel, Jerusalem, the residents of Jerusalem would have been desperately looking for help from anywhere. They were probably looking to Edom, to the south, thinking, do our bloodlines mean anything at this time of sorrow? May our brothers maybe come and rescue us and help us? Not a chance. In verse 11 it says, Edom stood aloof. While the carnage took place, they watched and they rejoiced. This was the fruit of their pride. This was the fruit that pride produced in their heart. Their hearts grew cold and calloused, unfeeling. But it gets worse. It would have been bad enough if the Edomites just remained aloof, but it got worse. They celebrated and gloated in the streets over Israel's defeat, kind of like when the Palestinians were dancing and rejoicing in the streets after 9/11. But then the Edomites went as far as going into Jerusalem after it was left defenseless, and it plundered the city. They had death squads waiting outside, and they waited for refugees and then cut them down and killed them. If there were any survivors, they handed them back to the attacking armies. And they did this to their brothers. That's what most offended God. But I want you to think about this. We're not so unlike the Edomites if we're really honest with ourselves. In Edom, we see the ugliness of our pride. When we live in the bondage and in the prison of pride, sometimes we're reduced to looking for any opportunity to exalt ourselves over others. It's true of nations. It was true of the Edomites. It's true of adults. It's true of kids. It's our human nature. It's the native air we breathe. I love this quote by John Piper. He said, apart from the grace of God, we all tend to derive pleasure from another person's failure. It helps cover up our own inadequacies and magnifies our successes and our accomplishments. Edom should have been humbled. They should have looked at God's judgment on his own people and thought, if God will do that to his own people, woe is me. They should have repented. Instead, they grew proud and hard. One commentator that I came across described the book of Obadiah as kind of like a little book that's in actuality an atomic bomb. He said it's a little book with a powerful, potent, explosive message. To be honest with you, the first time I read it, I missed a Pauline team meeting. And they told me what I was going to be preaching on. It was the week where they assigned the preaching. The first time I read it, I thought, man, this is payback. This is payback for missing this meeting. I read it, and all I saw was doom and gloom, and I thought, how do you preach this message? And but as I've been chewing on this book of Obadiah for the last 2 weeks, God has exploded that atomic bomb in my heart. That's been my experience for 2 weeks. As I've studied the sin of Obadiah,